Polls, surveys, ethnographic studies, year after year, in many places, have come to the conclusion that many people, when asked, always put their Muslim identity among the top part of their identification. They feel that being a Muslim is one of the most important things for them in their life and helping them organize their life. And if that's the case, we should be able to imagine a country called Muslimstan. If there's such a country existed, it would be larger than Russia, it would have more people than China, it would have a bigger economy than the United States. But why is it, despite that people say that being Muslim is so important to them, that this is a country which is imagined, not experienced? And what I'm going to try and do in this talk is perhaps suggest some kinds of answers to that. The first one would really be the most obvious one, would be to say, well, maybe it's imagined because the idea of the Ummah isn't a territorial one. Being part of the Ummah is something else. It's an idea. It's an ideal. It's not to do with territory. And so the first thing we need to do is really think about how we can theorize the Ummah. How can we actually say what it is? And part of it is, of course, that it is the totality of what Muslims believe. It is the totality of what Muslims all over the world consider themselves to be a part of. And sometimes the Ummah presents itself through the experience of events around the mobilizations around Gaza, where we have seen Muslims from all over the world identifying and recognizing their Muslimness in the identification and support of the people for Palestine. But most of the time, you have this contradiction. Everyone says that the Ummah is a great idea, everyone believes in it, but no one seems to be able to practice it. And we have to ask why that might be the case. Now, previously, Mr. Malik said that we need to design a new system. And I thought this was a very wise thing to say, that there is a need to design a new system. The trouble is this, that designing a new system and implementing it is going to be a struggle. It is really because the old system will always remain in place. So it's important for us to think about how we can learn to struggle to bring a new system into view. One way of thinking about struggle is really to talk about it as the name that we give to politics. The name of the political is the name of struggle. And struggle is about both taking sides and understanding that something new is necessary because something that was old no longer works for us. And I want to begin by arguing that there's an intimate relationship between Islam and the political. And the way I would suggest this is ask you to, for a moment, reflect on this quote. And given that, and just to think, Muhammad of Arabia ascended to the highest heaven and returned. By God, if I had reached that point, I should never have returned. How many people here would say they would have returned? I can't see your hands because the lights are not on, but let's assume that most of us would not have returned. What makes the prophet, as Iqbal goes on to argue, is the fact that he returned. And he returned to change the world. He returned to change society. He returned to struggle to change the world, change society, rather than simply remain where he was in the highest heaven. And I would say to you, the return of the Prophet is the beginning of politics of Islam. Islam is not simply contemplation and religion. It is actually about action as well. It is about making the world a better place, making our communities a better place, making ourselves better people. And that is always going to be involving a struggle. So I think if you reflect on this for a moment and you see that the difference between mysticism and political action, or being politically aware, or raising political consciousness, all of them are intrinsic to what I think we could all agree is the essence or the central point of Islam. The return of the Prophet is the beginning of Islam in a way that we are all Muslims because of the return of the Prophet. Now, I think it's important to then reflect upon why is it that despite this, we are already in the situation that we find ourselves in. So we've said two things so far. We've said that the sense of being Muslim is very, very strong, which has been demonstrated again and again in various surveys and studies, etc. We've also said that the idea of changing the system or bringing transformation is strong. We've also said that Islam and the political are not alien to each other, but they are actually the beginning of Islam and the beginning of the political are all wrapped together. So the question then really is, why is it, despite all of these situations, despite the belief in and the importance of Muslim identity and the idea that being a Muslim is about the political, we are where we are? Because I'm sure no one here would doubt that if there was this imagined country, this country of the dreams, if it became real, do we not think that the experience of the Palestinians would be better, or the Rohingya, or the Uyghurs, or the Kashmiris, or all of us? So the question is, why is it the case? Now, one answer, which comes from Orientalism and Westoxification, is that the reason why it's always the case is that Muslims have always been divided. The Muslims have always lived in a permanent state of division. Such an answer mistakes cynicism for wisdom, because it's based not on our understanding of the history or the historical record, but based on our assumptions and a history that we have inherited from Orientalists rather than arrived at ourselves. So the most important thing, or one of the important things that we have to do, is think about how to understand the actual circumstances that lead to the fragmentation of the Ummah, despite this sense that there is an Ummahtic consciousness which erupts from time to time. How can we sustain it? How can we make it more significant in the way of transforming and making the world a better place? I would like to suggest that perhaps what makes us more fragmented and divided isn't any innate quality in Muslims or any innate quality in Islam or any innate quality in humans. It is simply that there are barriers to being able to struggle. The barriers to politicization and raising political awareness. And these include how the depoliticization, purposefully a depoliticization, which occurs to try and make people forget that the world we live in, the social institutions that we have, are not natural, they have a history. It is forgetting of that history and how they came to be that leads to depoliticization. And depoliticization then blocks the ability for us to think, not only to design new systems, but how do we get to having those new systems? What is the process of implementation rather than simply a process of invention of those new systems? And that, it seems to me, is really important to consider. And I'd like to suggest that there are perhaps three things that we can argue that prevent us from learning better how to struggle. The first of these is literalism. And by that, I mean there's a tendency to reduce Islam to simply a matter of texts and a particular reading of texts. And we spend so much time reading the texts, not reading the history around those texts. That in itself is both a question of our ignorance and an ignorance that's been imposed, but an ignorance that we are complicit in. The second thing I would like to suggest to you is the question of legalism, that we think that all we have to do to find the pathways to struggle is find the right legal ruling in Islam that will resolve all our problems. And that, in a way, is the way forward. And I would say to you, this is again a symptom of our inability to recognize a history behind those rulings and simply to obey those rulings in a way that doesn't allow us to think that they are historically constructed but historically implemented. And the final thing I would like to suggest to you is our absorption of liberalism. And what I mean here is this, that we, in a way, are still imitating what the West tells about itself. The stories it tells itself, we believe them to be the case. And part of them is that all struggle really should not be a struggle. We should simply accept that history has come to an end, and the meaning of all history is basically a Western society. Some of you may have seen this Islamicity Index recently, which tried to make a league table of the most Islamic countries in the world. And lo and behold, it was almost identical to the list produced by the most habitable cities. At the top of this list were countries of like Scandinavia, Western Europe, etc., etc. This, in a way, is a kind of what I mean by liberalism, that it denies that there is a difference between disagreements are possible and that we can still disagree about what is the best way to organize society or the best way to organize our economies and our lives. So, what stops us reclaiming the Ummah is the continuation of an illusion. An illusion that when most of the Muslim countries became independent, they became independent not just because they have a flag and a football team, but they became independent intellectually, culturally, socially. And we know that's not the case. We know that the independence, it requires independent and critical thinking. It requires being able to imagine a world different than the one that we've inherited. So we remain locked in to this idea that decolonization is something we don't need, we are free. But I think the events of the last few weeks demonstrate that our freedom is conditional and contingent on us behaving in a way that was expected of us to behave. We still don't have the ability to write our own history. I think the final thing I would want to say is that decolonization will be a violent process, not in the way of necessarily bloodshed, but necessarily in the way of uprooting, to rethinking many of the things that we thought to be natural, to to be comfortable. We need to be able to start thinking anew. To reclaim the Ummah means that we need to recognize the biggest enemy of reclaiming the Ummah is not Muslims themselves, but it is how Muslims have internalized ethno-nationalism as a form of Western modernity. That we tend to see the world through the lens of technocrats who have been educated often in Western institutions. We now assume that the history has finally ended, but we don't, so therefore there's nothing new for us to imagine. And what I think decolonization proposes, the idea of the violence comes from the fact of having to imagine a new history, a history in which Muslims are the authors of their own fate, rather than simply subjects to the predations and violence and deprivations and oppressions of others. On that note, I'd like to thank you.